MedCram.com.
Welcome to another MedCram video. Today we have a doozy. Today we're going to review this most impressive publication that just got published in Nature Scientific Reports on the 8th of July 2025, titled Longer Wavelengths in Sunlight Pass Through the Human Body and Have a Systemic Impact Which Improves Vision, by Glenn Jeffrey, Robert Fosbury, Edward Barrett, Chris Hogg, Marissa Rodriguez-Carmona, and Michael Barry Pauner. This is a study to really look at what we've been talking about here on MedCram in terms of light and the human body and its effects, and it really puts down pretty definitively what we've been suggesting based on the data that has come before. So let's get into this article. If you like this type of medical information explained clearly from a viewpoint that's not pharma-sponsored, I really highly encourage you to join us at MedCram.com, where we have continuing medical education classes on things like ECG interpretation explained clearly, Chem 7, medical acid base, CBC, sleep apnea. We are used at major universities and have those endorsements. Join us at MedCram.com. Since the pandemic, we can go back to one of the first videos that we did on light as medicine, the thing that really kind of blew things open. And this was based on Scott Zimmerman and Russell Ryder's article that was published back in 2019, looking at the optics of the human body and how light can penetrate deeply through and actually cause effects in the mitochondria, the powerhouse of the cell, and is also the basis for a lot of chronic disease. We also showed you in a video back in January of 2023 a randomized controlled trial looking at 940 nanometer light given to COVID patients in the hospital at random, showing there was a number of outcomes that were improved at a statistical significant basis, even discharged from the hospital a full 4 days faster. We also showed you Glenn Jeffrey's study that showed that there was a 27% reduction in the peak of glucose after being exposed to 670 nanometers of red light, and that was from his lab. And then we've talked to you just recently here in 2025 about a new rule that is coming up and going to be implemented in 2028 that's going to make LED bulbs even more efficient, which means that they're not going to be giving off in the broad spectrum that we're used to getting from the sun. And basically, what does all this boil down to? And it's this sort of paradigm right here, which is that near-infrared light coming from the sun or coming from lamps can penetrate deeply within the skin, affect changes in the mitochondria, which reduce oxidative stress, increase ATP, which is the power of the cell, increase carbon dioxide, which just simply means metabolism, and as a result, reduce the fuels that are used to generate that. And this is important because if you want to live long, you have to realize that the enemy of longevity is chronic disease, and that there are a number of diseases which in this country make up the majority of chronic disease. And the one thing that they all have in common is that they're all sort of based in the mitochondria. So when the mitochondria don't work very well, they don't work very well. And as it turns out, there is one thing, it seems, that can improve mitochondrial function, and we're noting that that is infrared light. To review, these are the guys in the last 3 or 4 years that have really hit home and done a very good job of publishing and showing what light can do for the human body. And that's Scott Zimmerman. He's a light engineer, one of the co-authors for that first paper in 2019, Melatonin and the Optics of the Human Body. He teamed up with Russell Ryder out of University of Texas in San Antonio, who is the executive editor of Melatonin Research Journal. Glenn Jeffrey and Bob Fosbury, sort of the dynamic duo out of London at UCL, or University College of London, who are names, by the way, on this paper that we're just about to review, and real trailblazers in their department of ophthalmology. Glenn Jeffrey doing a lot of the research. Bob Fosbury is an emeritus astrophysicist and astronomer with the European Space Agency, also worked on the Hubble telescope. All of these guys are experts in the field and a great team to work with. So what did they say? Go back to Scott Zimmerman and Russell Ryder's paper. It showed in 2019 that infrared light can penetrate up to 8 centimeters. And notice it just kind of bounces around until it finally gets absorbed. I actually had this photograph before it was published here in the Nature article because I got it from Robert Fosbury himself, and I used it by permission. You can see here very clearly that infrared light can penetrate very easily through soft tissue. We also talked about, by the way, the effect of clothing on the transmission of infrared light. We'll get into that as well in this article. But we've shown you this before, and you can see here that it takes numerous layers of clothing before you get any sort of diminishing of infrared light. Trees. This is a photograph taken by Bob Fosbury, and you can see here very clearly that anything with grass, leaves, trees, things that are green, highly, highly reflective of infrared light, and therefore potentially very beneficial. This goes without saying that we know already and have known for decades that people who live in green spaces have less diabetes, less all-cause mortality. For a long time, people thought that this was related to demographics of people living in those spaces. People had more money. They were more upperly mobile. They could afford healthcare. And then there was the Green Heart Louisville project, which planted 8,000 trees in 4 square miles and over a 2-year period of time measured the same 715 subjects in that area and found that highly sensitive CRP levels dropped by anywhere from 13 to 20%, which correlated to about a 15% drop in strokes. And this is just by planting trees. Amazing, amazing stuff. Could it be that sunlight is the thing that we're missing? During the pandemic, it was well known that patients who had vitamin D levels that were normal or high did much better than those that had low vitamin D levels. And we've talked about this before, the paradox of this. And simply, it very well may be that vitamin D, not only in terms of its health benefits, could also be a marker of sunlight that helps in other ways. For instance, infrared light. We know that ultraviolet B radiation is responsible for the production of vitamin D in our skin. However, it's also a marker of all of the other benefits that we're now finding out. And we'll talk more about that. That's setting you up for this paper that we're about to talk about. We also know that infrared light hits the very same toll-like receptor that is involved in COVID-19, and it reduces inflammation in vivo. We also know that if we look across the United States, England, and Italy in this study that was published out of the University of Edinburgh, it showed very clearly there was a correlation between ultraviolet A radiation and reduction in COVID-19 mortality. In fact, the authors of this study said that it suggests that optimizing sun exposure may be a possible public health intervention. Given that the effect appears independent of a vitamin D pathway, it suggests possible new COVID-19 therapies. And as we talked about, there was the randomized placebo-controlled blinded study in Brazil, which looked at 30 subjects admitted to the hospital sick with COVID-19. And even though the group that was randomized to the intervention was actually more sick than the control group, they actually ended up doing much better after being exposed to this very same type of light, which is infrared light. We're going to talk more about that. I've told you about my experiences with patients in the hospital with COVID-19 and how they rapidly got better when I took them outside. This is no surprise. This is nothing new. We used to do this all the time, well before we knew about the science behind this, because people who were doing it, like Florence Nightingale, could see a benefit. And we've also shown you the epidemiology where we have both infectious diseases and non-infectious diseases throughout the season. Heart disease, COVID-19, lower respiratory diseases, Alzheimer's, diabetes, influenza, kidney disease, all of these things have the lowest mortality rates just weeks after the longest day of the year and have the highest mortality rates just weeks after the shortest day of the year. And this holds true in both the northern and southern hemisphere, respectively. With all of that in mind, let's look at this paper that was just published titled Longer Wavelengths in Sunlight Pass Through the Human Body, which have a systemic impact, which improves vision. And it's no surprise that Glenn Jeffrey and Bob Fosbury would look at vision since they're in the Department of Ophthalmology. They have the tools to actually look at that. But it's important to understand that because as we'll talk about, vision and the ability to see color specifically is highly dependent on very good activity of mitochondria in the retina. By the way, the retina is the tissue in the body with the highest concentration of mitochondria, and it's because of the work that it needs to do. So it sort of sets itself up as a perfect trial basis of seeing whether or not you're going to affect change in the mitochondria. Let's take a look at this paper. Here's the abstract, and I want to focus on what they say here. Here we show that infrared wavelengths from sunlight can be measured after they pass through the human thorax. That means the chest. We then select a prominent transmitted solar wavelength range, and that's from 830 to 860 nanometers. This again is invisible light, and they deliver it to the thorax of subjects in the lab in controlled 15-minute exposures, with and without ocular involvement. So they basically will put a aluminum container over the head of these subjects to absolutely make sure that they cannot be exposed to this type of light. Clothing reduced wavelength intensity, but was not a barrier. These exposures were associated with significant improved visual function when measured 24 hours later, even in subjects in which the light was blocked from their eyes. So we're going to talk about this effect where you expose part of the body with infrared light and you actually get health benefits on another part of the body that was never exposed to that light. Our data show that longer wavelengths of sunlight penetrate through the human body and, consistent with animal studies, have the ability to improve function. While infrared light has been used on targeted tissues, its ability to improve distal tissues in humans has not yet been explored. This study also highlights the potentially important therapeutic value of sunlight, whose longer wavelengths can reach key organs even through clothing and likely promote mitochondrial function, counteracting the decline with age and disease. Now, that's an important point there at the end, is as you get older, theory of aging, specifically the mitochondrial theory of aging, states that ATP production in the mitochondria decreases by 70%. And so you can see here very clearly that if we can find ways of amplifying the amount of energy coming out of the mitochondria, we could actually affect change that might actually defy age. I want to mention a couple of papers that have been published prior to this one before we dive into it, showing very clearly that mitochondria in different tissues can communicate. This was a paper published in 2023, Intracellular to Interorgan Mitochondrial Communication in Striated Muscle in Health and Disease. And they said here at the bottom, myomitokinase, such as FGF21, GDF15, and mtDNA, can alter whole body physiology and systemic responses. This is something that is not out of the ordinary. I may also draw your attention to this article that was published not too long ago, showing that, in fact, human blood contains circulating cell-free mitochondria. In other words, free-floating mitochondria. Notice what they say here in the article. Yet, using flow cytometry fluorescence assays, Stevens et al. Recently reported that at least part of the cell-free mitochondria of human and murine blood could remain functional. Indeed, part of the cell-free mitochondria identified by flow cytometry and mitotracker green fluorescence appear capable of maintaining a mitochondrial membrane potential, since they retained the tetramethylene rhodamine ethyl ester probe, and such retention was lowered by the addition of the mitochondrial uncoupler. That's all to say that these things could actually remain active even though they're not in a cell, which is crazy. Without any further ado, let's get into this article with that background that's very important in mind. So one of the first experiments that they did was they had these subjects stand out in the sun at around noontime, and they did this without a shirt, and they measured the power of the sun at the level of the patient before it went into the patient. They measured that at 17 milliwatts per square centimeter. Then they had a detector on the other side that could measure how much of that light went through the thorax of that patient. The thorax of that patient is about 30 centimeters. And on the other side, they measured 5.6 microwatts per square centimeter. Now realize that these are different units. This is 1,000th of a milliwatt. And so you can see here that this is a very small amount of light that came through on the other end. You can see it here through daylight transmission through the thorax. Here's the blue, which represents how much light is going through the thorax of this patient. It's up here, and here's the scale on this side. And over here on this side, you can see a much smaller scale, but you can see also that the transmittance wavelengths and exactly where the gap was. Much of this visible light could not penetrate through, and it was only once you reached about 600 nanometers that you started to see a penetrance through the body of the human being. Here we have it tracked down here once we hit about 700, that the amount of energy in these longer wavelengths start to increase and get longer and longer and peak right about 850 nanometers. Another way of thinking about it is if you look here at the difference between the blue and the red, what went in and what came out, the areas where there is the smallest difference, right about here, is the maximal area where you have the most amount of transmittance through the human body of this type of light. For this reason, they looked at this and they said, it looks as though for a human being, 850 nanometers, which is not visible light, it's in the infrared spectrum, but 850 nanometers is exactly the type of wavelength that seems to penetrate best through the human body. And you can see here, they looked at not only the absolute amount of energy that could go through in terms of transmittance, but also the relative amount. You can see the relative amount, we're talking 0.004%. A very, very small amount gets through. The majority of the light that hits the human body gets inside, bounces around, and gets absorbed. This type of a result is exactly what we would have predicted to see. We would estimate that a very small amount of light can get through the human body, and that type of infrared light is going to be absorbed by many different absorbers, but specifically what we believe is proteins and electron transport chains in the mitochondria. The next thing they did, because they found that 850 seemed to work the best, is they got a panel of LED lights that transmitted at 850 nanometers. And in this case, it was about half the strength at about 50 centimeters away from the subject. And again, they're going through the thorax, but about half the power that they did with the sun. They had a box with a detector at the other end, and there was such a small amount that came through that they were not able to measure the amount that came through in that situation. I leave this up here just to show you what it was for the thorax and what daylight transmission was. We weren't able to do the same for the 850 nanometer panel. However, they were able to show how much of a small amount it was. And you can see here the absolute value of what came through, and you can see here many more zeros after the decimal, and the percent. It was actually a very small amount of transmittance that was coming through. But it was detectable, and again, this showed that 850 nanometers, which is in the near infrared spectrum, can go and penetrate quite deeply into the body and even come out the other side. Then they did another experiment, and again here, what they're trying to see is whether or not this 850 nanometer light is actually affecting a physiological change in the body. So yes, they've shown that this type of wavelength can penetrate through the body. The next question is what is it doing once it gets in there? And that's exactly what they set out to do. And again, the reason why they looked at vision in this case is because vision, and specifically color vision, as we'll talk about, is very strongly tied to mitochondrial function in the retina. So they had three groups of people that got this 850 nanometers. The first one was the control group, which did not get any light at all. The LED lights were switched off. Of course, these people would not know that because they couldn't see it. First of all, it was on their back. And number two, you can't see this light anyway. It's invisible to the human eye. The next group got exposed both to the head and the body. And the third group, the body only. They put this actually aluminum foil hat, if you will, over their head so that there was no way any of this light could have reached the person's head or eyes or anything like that. And then what they did was they checked their vision. And specifically what they're looking at here is color perception. The reason why this is the one that's tested is because color perception is so highly dependent on the mitochondria in the cones of the eyes. So if we take a look again, here's the eyeball. You can see here as light penetrates through the retina and all these neurons, it goes to the back, and that's where the photochemical reaction occurs back here, and it gets transmitted up here to the optic nerve and then to the brain. But let's zoom in on this area here. We have a lot of rods, as you can see here, these gray things. Those things are what is detecting light. But you also have these cones that are colored green, red, and blue. And that's what we want to talk about because these cones are packed with mitochondria. And as you get older, these mitochondria don't work as well, but the cones are still there. And there are three types of cones. There are L cones, which typically pick up red light, and a red deficiency. So if you get worse red cones or L cones, the type of color blindness that you will have is something called protan, pro meaning the first. The next one are M cones. That's the middle. M stands for the middle range of visible light. And they kind of look for green. And because that's the second type, that color blindness, if you don't have those cones working very well, are called deutan. And then finally, the S or the short wave that pick up the blue are known as tritan or triton types of color blindness. Can we, through the administration of infrared light that nurtures mitochondria and allows them to produce more ATP, reverse or lower the threshold of people who have protan color deficiencies and tritan? Those are the ones that we're actually going to look at here in this experiment. So let's take a look at that. And here we see the results. So protan and tritan. So these are the cones that look for red light, and the ones here on the right are the cones that look for blue light. So here's our control. And as you can see, people that had whatever color blindness level that they had, it's not the genetic type of color blindness. We're just talking about the inability for those cones to work very well as you get older, which is normal. Notice that the control group, the people that did not get any of the 850 nanometer infrared light, there was no change. They were still at 100% of that threshold. However, those that got irradiated with 850 nanometers, 50 centimeters away from the panels, this is head and body that they're getting. Head and body irradiation. Notice that the threshold dropped statistically significantly down to this level. In the group that got only the body, they did not get any 850 on the head, there was a 5% drop. In other words, there was a reduction numerically, but it wasn't to the same degree as those that actually had it also going to the head. So this was not statistically significant with the 5%, but it was statistically significant with the 9%. Let's move on to the other type of color blindness, which was the triton. And again, the control group, there was no change from 100%. However, for those that get the head and the body irradiation, so hitting both places, there was a 16% drop in the threshold. That means that they were able to see differences in color much better when they had exposure to the head and the body of 850 nanometers light. That group that only had the body exposed, there was a reduction that was statistically significant, but it wasn't as much as those that got irradiation to both the head and the body. This is known as the abscopal effect. This means that mitochondria that are affected by light directly can seem to communicate this upregulation of energy production and cause an effect at an area distal to this. So this is actually really interesting. What we're seeing here, and what we've talked about for a few years, those people who are MedCram listeners and have been watching us, is that near-infrared light, yes, it can penetrate through the skin. Yes, it bounces around throughout the whole body, which may cause the abscopal effect. But it seems as though we know that mitochondria can communicate with each other and get that effect of not just local reduced oxidative stress and increased ATP, but global. And that actually may be the reason why we saw in this video that we published back in late September of 2023 that there was a 27% reduction in glucose in these patients that were receiving light therapy. We know that this stuff can penetrate. This is a photograph that we've shown you before many times, but it was published in this article as well. Again, this is Bob Fosbury's hand, and you can see very clearly here that at 850 nanometers, there was a very good penetrance. What's interesting is that it either goes right through or around any of the bones, which you do not see. What does pick up the light, however, is deoxygenated blood. Notice how dark it is, and it can pick that up. The other thing that they looked at was the factor of clothes, which we've already talked about. They say that the transmission of light through clothing was mitigated here. Images were captured with a camera whose sensitivity covered the visual and infrared range. Each panel contains an image of light transmission through 1, a t-shirt, 2, another shirt, and 3, a woolen jumper. All of them hanging on a hanger. So that's actually 6 layers. The left image here is ambient daylight. The middle image is backlit with an LED lamp, both photographed in visible only light. And also here on the right, the same as in the middle image, but taken with an infrared camera that looks at 750 to 1000 nanometers, passing only the 850 nanometer light from a 54 watt 660/850 nanometer Candir red light therapy LED lamp. This shows that the clothes are nearly 100 times more transparent at 850 nanometers than in the visible. The answer is the NIR light penetrates normal indoor clothing quite effectively. So what's very important to understand here that this paper that was just published in Nature shows us is that not only LED in the infrared light, but also sunlight even to a bigger degree can very easily penetrate through the skin and can have beneficial effects in the body, not just at the area where the rays of the sun are focused. And this is important because we are increasingly living in an environment where we are deprived of that very type of light. We live in buildings that have windows that are designed to filter out infrared light because that type of light heats up buildings and increases air conditioning costs. We also told you about a new rule in the United States that will go into effect in 2028 that will take LED bulbs and squeeze as much of what they call wasted energy, making these wavelengths that are invisible and only making wavelengths that are contributing to the lumens, because there's going to be a new threshold for making LED bulbs with much higher lumen to watt ratios. And while I do believe that it matters what type of lights you have in your home, Glenn Jeffrey did a study just showing recently that we haven't actually talked about, but we'll do a video on, that people who live in environments with LED bulbs who get switched out with incandescent bulbs in that type of environment actually get the same type of improvement that we are seeing here in this video. I'm all for getting the right type of bulbs, but nothing is going to beat, in any sense or form, getting outside and getting actually into the sunlight. I think that the article was outstanding. It was done very well, and I look forward to hosting Glenn Jeffrey on this channel so we can talk to him, and also Bob Fosbury. There are many other groups that are working on similar projects, and I expect that photobiomodulation is going to explode even more than it already has. I highly recommend that you share that article, which we will have a link to in the description below. And also don't forget to join us at medcram.com. Thanks for joining us.